Yeah, we're there. So I'm Betsy Cunningham, and welcome to Southern Oregon Progressive Podcast once again. We have a couple of folks in the room, um, Zach and John, who have been joining us, are, I guess, a regular part of us now, and then Joanne. And what we're going to talk about is a couple of things. And anything that anybody in the room wants to talk about as far as what's going on locally, or going on nationally, state and nationally, that has an impact in Douglas County or in Southern Oregon. So this podcast and the main topic of fire map, the con, and more. The and more is the other stuff, but the fire map, the con. One of the things that spurred that is I subscribe to ProPublica, and they came out with an article. They do, one of the best investigative journalisms from my point of view, um, in many things. And they came out with an article about how the fire map that was created after the fires of 2020 by the state legislature to try to identify which properties in the state of Oregon were at risk because of the fires that we have and are going to be having in the future. That was done. And then what happened is there was a backlash to it. And a lot of that was created by misinformation. And what really piqued my interest in the combination of the two had a lot to do with um, what I had heard our state representatives at a town hall that they had at Roseburg City Hall. And it was led by Brock Smith, who's the state senator from the most of Douglas County. And then there was Alex Garlatos, who represents the southern part of Douglas County, and Virgil Osborne, who represents probably the biggest chunk of Douglas County for the state house, which includes Roseburg, and then Kurt Boyce, who represents the coastal area. And they're all Republicans, and they were kind of gleeful about their power to be able to stop something from happening. And they were kind of lauding that they were, they were stopping the map. And they were doing that by constituents and good organizing. And from, the point of view of political organizing, is if you really want to make effective change, at least from my opinion. And usually that is supported by some, documentation about it, is to constantly organize and connect with your legislators, right? They assume that a certain number of people contacting them results in opinions and potentially votes that are exponential from the contact. So they look at, political science view, that if there's so many people that, one person's talking to them, sending them letters, and they know people in their sphere of influence can do that. So they look at this as a, political power, which it can represents, just literally can represent, and then sometimes represents because they're the only people doing it, right? And even so, there's a disproportionate amount of power, and that may be what happened. But when you're looking at Douglas County, the problem is you may have had a good number of people from that point of view that the map was wrong, that it was going to be used to decide how much insurance companies were going to charge people or whether they were going to cancel fire insurance. And they started using all this, really what is now, which is ProPublica's article's point of view, that it was based upon misinformation, that those things that they were telling people, even state legislators, it was inaccurate. And the big hurdle was being able to get the accurate information out there. And then the article discusses a little bit about how the staff at the state, in the state, that oversees this failed to actually do a public relations, marketing and let people know what the facts were. So the state actually made the ability for this to happen. That's my conclusion, by failing to really get out there and make sure that the public knew what was going on. And so I'm not a homeowner. And fire and wildfire obviously should concern all of us, just on a practical level. We've had three fires really relatively close to Roseburg, which is the biggest, center of humans together in the last couple of weeks. We had one today at the dump, the county dump, and it was extinguished relatively quickly. I live across where I'm looking at Mount Nebo, which, parallels I-5. A little over a week ago, that was on fire. And I don't know the cause of the dump, but they suspect the Mount Nebo um, fire was human caused, and the one in 10 Mile that's now still, I think, still going on in 10 Mile is, human caused, but they didn't identify what exactly that meant. But going back to then the potential of fire, right? As a citizen, I'm concerned about that. When I heard about the map, I thought that it sounded a good idea. And I was frankly a little bit surprised we didn't already have it, right? That we don't have already a state sponsored, not an insurance company sponsored. So I don't know if folks, I put it out there when I advertise for this, and it's always short notice because I'm a procrastinator. But I put a link to the ProPublica piece that I got and read, and it just kind of really piqued my interest because again, it's really coming down to it when I read about the state being blamed for failing to provide information. It's kind of the same thing that happens in the other things we're going to discuss about locally, the public transportation, the stuff, the turf war in regarding the park in Roseburg and its past, the parks in the county, and all the way that government just seems to I know that people are a pain in the ass, right? When citizens are involved, they can really be a pain in the ass to people who just want to do what they want to do. Heck, that happens in our lives, right? You know, and when so this idea of accountability always sounds good. Even some of the stuff in Oregon law is good on paper, but as we all know, when we don't pay attention, there's a lot of times that it doesn't even get followed. So we go back to that. So just the highlights of the ProPublica, and I'm not a fire expert, and I was hoping that Kevin would be here because he has some firsthand knowledge because is a wildland firefighter and has been for the last few years and is raised around this stuff, raised here, has some kind of, certainly an opinion from that point of view and more knowledge on the fire and fire prevention than I do. And maybe probably all of you have more knowledge about that than I do. But the um, the idea is that they were able to garner this power sufficient to get the state including um, the representative Jeff Golden, who is on the Environmental Wildfire Committee in the state Senate, to support it, buying the argument that the people hadn't been notified and that's why they were so cranky. I don't know that I really understand the rationalization all that well, because if it is necessary to do, to let a small group, because we have a supermajority in the Oregon House, and so that means Senate and the House. And so to pander to this outcry just seems to be ridiculous if it interferes with this being effective in helping people prevent wildfire right now, particularly given, this small illustration of fires, but there's bigger fires going on in Oregon right now. Um, so that is kind of the one other important part is the big sell seemed to be that your insurance companies were using this to deny you insurance, that they were using this to increase your rates. And so people really, really got up in arms in that. But the industry has always used their own data and done their own assessment of risk and have set their rates on that. Not just fire, we all know that, right? That how much you pay for medical insurance if you're doing it individually and even in a group, the assessment of how many people are old or, have disabilities are actually a factor in rate setting for everything. As far as insurance, they're in the business of making money, right? They're capitalist enterprises. They're not charity. They're not worried about really limiting loss to you. They're about, the big hope that that loss doesn't happen big enough and they have the ability to make a whole lot of money. I mean, insurance companies are, I think probably problematic for every industry. But, the thing that we should be talking about may be state insurance, right? Public insurance option in this arena for everyone, and eliminate the industry. But that's really kind of the holdup in getting healthcare reform. So they ultimately, in the story, the ProPublica, that they did admit the insurance companies kind of just let that lie, right? Because they didn't want to take the criticism from the people. They actually were alleged to have had messaging agents and stuff actually letting people believe it was the state that was setting the rates for the insurance company. And so that was one of the big reveals from the ProPublica investigation, is that's not true. That, I mean, they may have been doing that, but now they've had to admit, no, we have our own rate assessment and we didn't use this state, but it's already been repealed, right? We're at a time that right now that this whole mess. So that's why I call it a con. And I'm particularly offended by, the what I watched Brock Smith and at that town hall, kind of say, oh, look at what we've done. We've been able to control the state legislature. And then lo and behold, 2 weeks ago, we talked about what they're doing with ODOT, right? They did the same thing with the transportation bill, right? Allowed, they get Democrats to support it or it wouldn't pass. But the problem is, what tactics are they using? And is it the same kind of situation? Anyway, that's enough of my stump speech about this. Somebody want to chime in, make comments?
There's something interesting that you touched on there, Betsy. The belief, or at least the professed belief, that the information was being put together by the state when it was being put together by private interests or insurance companies. I'm reminded of this old understanding among certain socialists, 19th century, that those who were crying socialism, socialism, are enemies on the extreme left in mainstream politics are going to bring about a socialist society, a communist society. Well, all the people that they're talking about tend to be liberals, and there's a very similar phenomenon that occurred even as recently as 2020. I recall in the spring of 2020, early days of the COVID pandemic, when there were people posting photos of uh, supermarket and store shelves that were completely empty, especially of toilet paper. And often the comment was, look at this, this is what socialism does. When in fact, this is a capitalistic enterprise that we're looking at that is unable to supply what people need. That's not I'm not saying anything necessarily about state versus private or state versus capital here and their issues, but that claim that you're touching on in this does seem to be once again pointing fingers at the state when what's really being observed is capital at work, the marketplace at work, and one that is wholly inconsiderate of human life.
I think that's the big deal. I think that's absolutely right. That I was actually having a discussion with a younger person yesterday about the growth of, this doesn't sound like it relates, but I think it does, Christian nationalism among young men in America, and they listen to these sites I don't go to, so I'm not, and said there's a lot of dialogue that their criticism are fundamentally criticisms of capitalism, but they
Mhm.
want to blame them on immigrants, for example. So they want to have, and the policy of immigrants, right? And the policy of letting people um, illegally, and I hate using that term, immigrate here, but so yeah, I think it's all part of that strategy. So if there's a problem, and it really is, if you analyze it based on our economy, the way that that capitalism runs and the way that it needs to run to be successful, and success meaning for capitalists. But yeah, I mean, I think that is very interesting. And I don't know that this to be part of this, but I wondered when I was reading it how much of the state reports actually relied upon data that had been historically collected by these private insurance companies. Because if you're going to do research, as we all know, we all hear, probably done our fair share of, research on stuff, that you're going to look at wherever the sources are, what did they say historically? And so the ones that really react there do those actuaries, right? Isn't that what an actuary does? I believe in an insurance company is actually, runs that risk analysis. So who was doing that before the state decided they needed to intervene in the process?
Well, to
Well,
my understanding, that would be that would fall into the problem of what's often called neoliberalism, or the economic approach in government toward privatization. Effectively, everything has a private solution. Um, it doesn't sound so dissimilar from, I mean, to use the COVID pandemic as an example again. It's not so dissimilar from the fact that the data gathered by the CDC was reliant on, even private hospitals reporting the data. And of course, then we're relying on private hospitals, private entities to do that. Um, so that data that we associate with the state is largely, or at least to a great extent, gathered you know, by private interests, by non-state actors, and in a certain sense too, even nonprofits are technically private entities, even though they have that nonprofit legal status. Um, they also take responsibility for collecting data and reporting it to state agencies.
and influencing public policy, right? Directing, often and directing public policy. But as we'll discuss later, in the turf wars, it's not always good to have public employees control the the data and information either.
Well, there's a line. So I have the Oregon Public Broadcasting article on the fire map issue just from this last week up on my screen. And there's actually a really interesting quote that comes up from the House Republicans in Oregon. So they've obviously been saying repeal the wildfire hazard map, calling it faulty, defective, harmful. But one thing that was said about it is that, to quote OPB here, along with related fire-safe building and landscaping rules that are in the works, the state's map would be, quote, a heavy-handed bureaucratic takeover, unquote, that's kept rural residents from insuring or selling homes. And that uh, reference to bureaucracy is quite interesting to me. And it goes very hand in hand with the mentality of the present federal administration in the White House, um, most of Congress at this point. Um, but it also seems to be somewhat the case even locally here in Roseburg, Douglas County. Um, my understanding of what's being said there, a bureaucratic takeover, is that those who are governing our communities, or from our municipalities to our provincial states to the federal government, those who are at the helm, so to speak, are disinterested actors. A bureaucrat is unelected. They're not directly, beholden to an electorate. They're typically technical experts. They're hired to be technical experts in any one area. And elected officials look to them in, from congressional hearings to city council meetings. They look to them as exactly that, technical experts. And that technical expertise, and historically, comes with the expectation that these functionaries are to be somewhat neutral in their approach to administration. They choose what the best options are because they have experience and knowledge and training that, elected officials, many of whom might just be novice politicians, could be first time in office or something like that. They have far less knowledge in, and certainly not expertise. Um, and so when we're saying this is a heavy-handed bureaucratic takeover regarding the wildfire map, and this could be extended to many other issues that we face, it suggests that there's a problem with an administration consisting of not just technical experts, but technical experts who, at least to many understandings, are not going to simply go along with what the majority of the public wants. Majority of the public, not experts in what a bureaucrat might be specializing in. And because of that, the way that they operate might not really jive with the opinions of a majority of the population. Um, but the condemnation of that comes with the implicit assertion that those who should be at the helms of not just government, but administration, of carrying out what the government determines the administration should be doing, that even administrators should be politically interested, that they should be advocates in the same way that politicians, elected politicians are. That they should be operating in the favor of certain, usually very specific interests and interest groups.
Yeah. And as an advocate within the state of Oregon, a few systems within them, one being the vocational rehabilitation system, the other in the Medicaid, health, Oregon health plan system. I have found the bureaucratic state a little problematic, right? Absolutely, because of the reason that you say. And that, I've had, people like in the retired person from the Senior and Disability Services program, say, was criticizing me. And I said, well, if you actually did what you were supposed to, you would have never known my name. Right. And I said, people I help actually like me, so it's okay if you don't. And she says, well, of course they like you. And I said, but again, the problem is, and sometimes it is even that, I don't know how many times I hear, well, we've always done it that way. And so what I also see is a hostility, not just towards advocates like, me, but really more so the people that actually try to advocate for themselves, right? That they're hostile. And I guess the crux to me is some of this stuff, well, for one, sometimes they don't even follow their own rules. They follow the rules that the bureaucrat above them told them to follow, right? They have, so the rules go the state law. Let's just stick with the state law, state administrative rules, right? That come out of an electoral agency type of process. And then they have guidelines, and it used to be in the DHS, they called them technical assistance guidelines, but they could have a variety of names. And those are where the frontline people actually operate from. So who filtered that interpretation from the law? And then on the other side is what information, and I think we touched about this about homelessness last week, is the bureaucrats feeding the dialogue, right? The people, and it's not that objective. I mean, that's my real concern. I'm looking with the county. That's a little bit different because we don't have a county administrator, but the city councils, both, here and in Sutherland, are examples that I've most recently, but that is the problem, right? Is these bureaucrats really kind of leading the discussion? And sometimes it is that, like, the mayor says, this is my opinion, so they're trying to mold it around the mayor, right? The mayor gets his opinion because who the mayor hangs around with, who funds the mayor's campaigns, right? So then who is that secret government? I don't want to sound conspiracy theorist, but it's the power structure, right? That influences those decisions. And you're right, then it's kind of becomes that catch-22 as they become, they're constantly in sync with each other to influence it for a particular agenda. And it's not that objective stuff. And I think that the community rights movement is is a big thing for that. What you're doing is actually trying to help people understand they have the power, and not that they just have the power to influence, but it's becoming a necessity for people to not just let this happen. Because, all of us would like to be able to say, okay, yeah, we trust the bureaucrats because we pay them. They should be honest. They should tell accurate information. It should be objective. But when we don't see that, then, what do we do to influence public policy?
I I just when I read the article, I was struck by the fact that it it seemed is there wasn't any. It seemed like they didn't really have a plan. In other words, the Republicans kind of use everything as a scare attack. You're going to lose your, you're going to lose your, you're not going to be able to insure your house, yada yada. It seemed like if the state had it together more, that there's a additional part of this, and that is to provide the funding for the homeowners to do the things on their homes to make them more fire resistant, and which would enable them to to be able to get insurance. I mean, if if everybody could put metal roofs on their houses, I mean, out in these rural areas, I mean, that's a huge start right there. So I just felt that that needed to be another part of the whole thing, is like there there needs to be an agency with the funding to help to help people out. I know that DFPA and them, and I don't know if they still do. In the past, they have had grant money, available for rural residents to, to get brushing and that done around, around their places. And I think that's a element that needs to be included. That, without that, then they can, they can make it a scare thing with the insurance company. And a lot of people are too old and too busy to really do these kind of repairs around their place. So it's be nice if the money is there to to make their so that they can get their house fireproof.
Well, they have some Firewise programs, and
Yeah,
Kevin actually worked on those crews at one point.
yeah,
Between fire season, I think Phoenix School, right, was running, and I don't know what's happening to those, but those were grant funded, right? And you get
Yeah,
so much money and it's over. Well, that's stupid, right? Because if you don't have the resources to firewise everything, is it, are we still at risk? I mean, isn't everyone still at risk for some catastrophic wildfire? So to me, there's like three issues here. One is, yeah, how are we going to make sure this happen? And then the fundamental question is who's going to pay for it, right? How is it going to get paid for? But the other to me is to looking at again this insurance industry. Why is the insurance industry in this mess? Could there actually be a state run, God forbid socialism? But let's talk about the irony of that when these people who don't insure or underinsured, who voted for Trump, when their house burns down or when they get flooded out, they want the government to pay for it.
right.
Right? It sounds like socialism to me, right? They don't want to assume the risk. And in theory, and in the world of capitalist insurance, if people don't want to insure themselves, why should the taxpayer have to bail them out at all? Right? If your house burned and you now have to live on your property in a tent, isn't that your fault? You couldn't capitalize your mortgage payment to include insurance. You couldn't take the risk. It was too expensive. Should fundamentally the state bail you out when we continue to have this dysfunctional system? To me, that I think that's a question. And then the other part is really who's controlling government. Back to that fundamental question in my mind is who's controlling it. And I'm not again, I am for the state doing it, right, for everyone because of the big fundamental risk. But when we operate in this system, oh, I want freedom and capitalism, and I play that tune, and then as soon as that doesn't work out, now I want, I don't call it socialism, but now I want the government to fix it for me.
Mhm. It's always seemed to me that the um, disconnect there comes from the fact that, especially in rural counties in Oregon, the seats of government that we look to for that kind of aid are so far removed from our everyday. They're out of the hands of people locally, which is why I would say, not just a um, socialistic vision is needed, but a socialistic vision that is locally rooted and specifically democratic is necessary. And that I think is essential for even trusting what we would call a government. And at that point, government is you and your neighbors, not just, bureaucrats or elected officials up in Salem.
And fundamentally, that's where we have the most influence, right? As citizens, it really is at that local level, and the biggest ability to impact it, if we're engaged there, as opposed to, in, and it doesn't matter what political party you're in, as the transportation bill and this fire map, illustrates that idea of bipartisanship when it can be, manipulated. And particularly, I'm going to be particularly critical of the Democrats because this is not the first time they've had a super majority in the state legislature and have not utilized it the way it should be utilized. In my opinion, I mean, basically you don't pander to the minority at that point when there are these kind of philosophical differences, because that's what they are about, um, uh, tends to, if you have the majority of people who you assume have the philosophical as you, then the majority of the people in Oregon, at least the voters, I know all the data about that. But it seems very skewed to, for what reason do the Democrats pander to this degree to the Republicans? I mean, I don't know the answer. It's just kind of puzzling to do that.
Hmm.
So, anything else about the fire?
I think I would always stress for us in Oregon that I knew people who were hit hard during the fire a few years back down in Talent that wiped out a huge portion of the town. And uh, that kind of danger is not going away. And resources like a fire map uh, are pretty critical, in my opinion. We need that. We need to use the technologies that we have available to us to, I mean, not simply mitigate wildfire. I mean, wildfire in a certain sense does have a place in the upkeep of an ecosystem. I mean, ask any local indigenous people. I mean, fire farming has been a thing in Southern Oregon for since pre-colonial times. Um, but where we are now, wildfire, especially when it hits urban areas, is highly destructive of, I mean, not just property in people's homes, but it kills people. And we have to come to terms with the fact that we're living with this now. And we need to use the technologies that we have available to us and that we can develop to mitigate that destruction. Otherwise, a Roseburg or a Sutherland or somewhere else could be hit by a serious fire potentially, and that's not going to be a pretty sight. We don't want to end up like what happened to Talent or further south of us in Paradise in California some years ago, or even here just in Douglas County. I mean, I grew up partly in Glide, and the fires out there a few years back destroyed people's homes, and folks are still rebuilding.
And destroyed a whole lot of the forest. I mean, burned, temporarily, burned a whole lot of the forest up there. That's true. And well, and that's why living, I'm looking at Mount Nebo as we talk, the part that's all charred. And was coming out of a meeting of the library and somebody said, "Hey, look, there's a fire there," when it first started about, I just was around seven or so, that we were outside and then watched it as it progressed. And luckily it was put out. Um, because also, they have the communication systems right up at the top of Mount Nebo, right? So they have, even the emergency has, relays, and it took out the TV signal, right? The over air TV signal, but cable seemed to survive, the limited temporary assault on the mountain up there. But they did get it out. But living so close to it, I'm looking at it and it's saying, "Holy shit!" Right? And the amount of property that will be damaged, the structural property, the potential risk to life is certainly greatest in Roseburg and any of the more concentrated living areas. And but it also, with what John brought up is I do think that everyone should have this done, right? Because unfortunately, with the way that even I think that I understood the Firewise was running, that there would be really basically a grant, right? You would apply, you'd have to be approved, and there's some need for that, but at what level does that start costing money, right? It costs money to pay people to do all this. And then, what are you really trying to accomplish? Not really have, we do have limited amount of money, but should we have limited amount of money when it comes to something as critical as, being fire safe?
Mhm.
And those are questions that our legislature doesn't want to have is none of that stuff. Some of these issues, and it applies to homelessness and a variety of other issues. They don't want to have these discussions because, oh, people don't want to pay their tax dollars. So we probably need to have um, uh, make sure that um, everybody is involved in being able to benefit from this. And we're looking at the bigger, so the long-term solution as opposed to what politicians look at is what's going to get me elected next time. That is a flaw of our system. So,
Mhm.
anything else? So I had a couple other things that was brought to my mind, but number one on that list was the turf wars and the status of, the turf wars. So Zach, if you want to let us know.
Sure. Uh, for those who haven't heard, the city council ultimately voted in favor of moving forward with seeking grants to turf Fir Grove Park in Roseburg. And there are city councilors who I had myself talked to who I was rather initially surprised to see had changed their minds on the matter and voted in favor of the turf. Um, where we're at with it now is, of course, as has been made clear even by city administrators, ground would not be broken on this project until like 2027. So there's time. Um, Anything can still be stopped up until ground is broken on a project. Um, but I think that what has been really helpful about this now being brought to light with around the last two city council meetings is that more people in the local public know about it and for the first time. Um, the problem I see presently is that although a lot of people now know about it, some people, of course, are in favor, but quite a few, as I've seen, are pretty flatly opposed. One of the problems that I'm seeing is that uh, even though this has been publicized, the news reviews put out multiple articles on this. KPIC put out an article, um, and it's gone around the rings on Facebook, certainly. Even so, a lot of people who have heard about it don't really seem to know the details about the project. And I've seen plenty of folks stating their opposition. I'm speaking about, Facebook forums and such, especially stating their opposition to the turf, but citing data from old AstroTurf. And of course, that could easily be written off because, as advocates of turf here in Roseburg would say, is well, we're planning to use a different kind of turf, something that's most modern turf technology, and it will have less of the effects, the nasty effects of older forms of the product. Um, and so because there is that gap in understanding, despite hearing about this project, I think um, uh, a lot of folks are not making the needed criticisms, challenges to this project that need to be. Because it's really more about a public space, in my opinion. There are ecological questions that could be asked. There are um, water use questions, the effect on the river that could be asked. There's the question of the safety of play space for kids who are playing sports on the field. But in my mind, the main question that has to be asked, um, those who are in favor of turf and not, is what does it really mean for us when we're saying that a public park is um, going to be ripped up and replaced really for the primary, if not exclusive, use of certain sports clubs in the city. And I even know people who've been involved in the soccer club for years. I mean, even people who are not even around in Roseburg anymore who have expressed their interest in the turf plan. People who are involved in Roseburg Soccer Association back in 15 or so years ago, who also share a vision of Fir Grove Park being exclusively for soccer, for the soccer club, and this turf portion of the field, the plastic turf portion of the field, would be imagined as, yes, exclusive for the soccer club. That's I think a concern that I have a concern with that because it really goes beyond this present issue. The attitude regarding the turfing of Fir Grove Park really extends to the mentality that many in this community have about public space, about who it belongs to, who controls it, who gets to even have a say in what is done with it. Um, in the public comments that were being made, uh, there were some folks who I read statements from, heard statements from in one of the last city council meetings, who were positing this plan for the park as seriously meant to exclude unhoused neighbors from using the park. And I find that abhorrent on a few levels, but it does show me at least that um, the perhaps the general mentality that many seem to have about this turf plan. I mean, the people who are pro-turf mentality seems to be very superficial. Like a discussion of our neighbors who are living in the parks and on the streets here in our community uh, are talked about as having like personal individual problems, and there's no systemic understanding of the crisis of homelessness. There's no acknowledgement of how even the decisions that you know are made by decisions that are made by or pushes from certain classes of our society, such as those who are part of the soccer club in the Parks case, that those kinds of moves exacerbate the conditions of that conditions that create even homelessness in our community. It's far from mitigating an issue. It's certainly accelerating it in my mind. It's creating greater conditions for social exclusion, for the enclosure of space, specifically for private interest that do not necessarily benefit the majority of a community, and certainly not those in a minority who might value those spaces for one reason or another. So I think where we're at right now is regrouping. I think that above all else, what is needed in this struggle, this conflict, the debate is education. And it's education that goes beyond just the park issue. Because the park issue is, as I said, it is really about governance and administration and who is control of this community. Is it everyone who is in this community? The people, so to speak? Or is it a certain select group in this community?
Zach, I wanted to, one of the one of the arguments was that this guy, actually, this is kind of ironic because two of the people that have been on our community rights Facebook page that have been so pro this uh, this turf field for soccer is Joanne Gordon's is Joanne Gordon's grandsons, and and Joanne Gordon left. So anyway, he was saying that it's going to be fenced, but the fence is only going to be 3 or 4 feet high, and that they're going to have openings in it, so it's not so people can actually go in and everything, and it's only going to be a 3 or 5. And he's making it sound like it's the fence is just to keep people from driving cars on
it. Mm-hmm. Well, I could say about the enclosures of common lands, say even going back to England in the 1600s, 1500s. The long-term visual effect of that today in the English countryside are hedges and brambles that enclose, lands that are used for grazing sheep and such. And we can see this in England and Wales and similar areas. And as some hotshot YouTubers have shown, you can get through those if you really want to. You can hop over them, you could peel them apart and climb through them. It's very painful to, but you can. They're not really that tall. They're not so much an obstacle that one can't force their way through. But that does not change the fact that in creating those boundaries, you're not just creating a physical boundary, you're also creating, at least, long-term legal boundaries, and the appearance of boundaries, even the appearance of a fence that bisects a space is more than just being a physical barrier that one can or cannot cross, but a visual statement that tells any onlookers this is an exclusive space. This space is designated for a certain group of people for a certain use. And if you are to hop the fence, well, whether it is a criminal offense or not, it is a form of trespassing. Um, but I think also there's a case that can easily be made on the level of even those who are playing soccer out there. A 3 or 3.5 foot high fence for soccer players is not going to stop a ball.
Right.
A lot of young kids will kick a ball over that fence if they're trying to score a goal or otherwise. And that means that it's going to actually be inconvenient for soccer players to have that fence. They'll have to access one of those few gates around the perimeter of the field to run out and catch the ball that might have been kicked into the parking lot. Um, and I suspect, having played soccer in my young life, I suspect that it's also going to invite, um, uh, well, invite it. It will inevitably happen that kids are going to end up hopping the fence, climbing the fence to go get a soccer ball or something, something similar, but most likely to go get a soccer ball that's been kicked over. And kids are probably going to get hurt doing that. It's another hazard. It is another barrier that doesn't just keep people out, but it affects the people who are also using that space in a new way. I don't think that that has been thought of all the way through. So an argument could be made, well, you could have a turf field without fences, and that problem is mitigated. But of course, then if you have a just an open turf field without the fencing, um, basically anyone can use it. It has um, no limitation, no restriction on who gets to use it. And this is going to be a rented space effectively. People are going to be scheduling time to use this space. And so that fence is kind of necessary for maintaining that.
Well, they do that currently with Gaddis Park and baseball, right? They have an exclusive use for certain hours of those baseball fields. I've read it, and it has to do. I became aware of it because of the homeless issue, and this was actually when the pandemic was in full swing. A lot of people were living there, and then as people started to come back, I realized it, and it really made me think of what you originally said about the use of common space, right? What is our common ground? It's no longer common with these exclusive use agreements. And I'm not anti-children. I've had a few. And I have even more grandkids. And so, and I am very cognizant of providing children all kinds of developmental activities to make better human beings, if you will, and better, more human beings that have more options, right? But I don't see this, the same thing on the same side. You don't always see the same thing going into arts, going into writing, going into music, right? Of things that would develop children in other ways, the math bee or the spelling bee. We don't see those kinds of activities, and it's exclusive to this, and that's certainly driven by parents. I get it, but I am really concerned about the exclusive use, and I'm not an expert in turf. I have had some information since you brought this up that there are some kinds of more environmentally friendly that may use natural products as opposed to plastics for turf. I think the thing that piqued my interest when you were just talking a minute ago also is that we need to make sure the information we're using is accurate and is timely. And when I use people like ProPublica, and this is an important thing on anything and advocating for anything, whether it's politically, whether it's systemic individual advocacy, that accuracy and that credibility becomes very important. So I even like to avoid conspiracy theories. I can have all kinds of conspiracy in my head about what's going on, why it's going on. But I'm more cautious about articulating that to the bigger world because it segues, for one, moves the dialogue to disproving that as opposed to let's stick with what really is factual and what we know. So I think, and that's for everything. So those are things like in convincing maybe, city councilors or people to say, listen, we demand that you look at this logically, right? I don't know that we can, do much about Umpqua Health Alliance. Although I think since they're government funded, I do think that there is a tactic that could be used to approach them and say, hey, if what you're saying is not scientifically good, it's not good health practices, that puts children at risk, then you need to be out of the debate as an entity. Now, they can't necessarily stop individual doctors or, other medical professionals from having a personal opinion like every other citizen. But as an entity, they need to be I think they need to be cautious of, they're really speaking on behalf of that entity when they identify as that, as opposed to their individual opinion. And there is a lot of problems with injuries to children on artificial turfs of certain type. So why would a medical community be doing that? And I was thinking about tactics, and I'm going to go and I'm going to apply this basically to what we talked about with fire. Is that I missed this. What are we going to do about it? What can we do here? What can we suggest people do? About both of them. For one, what I'm going to say is, Joanne said, "Thanks for trying. I have PTSD from past forest fires, so I'm leaving now." That she left at the end of the fire discussion. And I really take that seriously because I don't know if it's post-stress PTSD, but I feel the same way. I have an anxiety level every summer, particularly since that glide fire. And my husband and I were camp host up Little River when the Apple Creek fire happened, 10, 15 years ago. And it was a major fire up there. And we were up in Wolf Creek campground all summer long while the fire burned. We were there, even when it was closed down, there was actually firefighters there. And so that didn't scare me. as much as what I saw because of the not just that, there was long periods of no fires, right? But every year and the increasing fire. So I feel for you, Joanne, and you live much closer to a potential explosive fire than she does. You know, maybe if people could put setting Mount Nebo on fire, she does. But that's a real serious thing. I mean, there's a level of anxiety. I'm sure that we're not the only people who feel this, right? About, are we going to have this devastating fire, and then are we prepared? Because that's the other thing. How prepared, are we individually and as a community? And I know, and sometimes like with during the pandemic and then the big heat bubble we had, Housing First Umpqua was, contacting our emergency management. Like, what are you doing about the heat bubble we're expecting for people living outside? And there was a woman who died a block away from me during that period of time because she was living outside. And the temperature they say in her tent was like 140 degrees. And she had some cognitive issues. And, the reality is that we do put people's lives at risk, not even in ways that we think about, with these things. But so with the fire thing, I will put up something regarding how to contact your state legislators, particularly ours here, right? The representative, particularly the guys that were at that town hall and, kind of, chest pounding. But also Jeff Golden, right? Because he's the chair, the Senate chair, and he is he's considered a somewhat progressive, Democrat in some people's eyes. And so, to say, well, all well and good what you say, but you should have, we need this map, right? The state needs to be doing this. And, maybe that, helps that ball rolling to some degree. And we can put that out there. You can put it out on community rights. We can do it on Southern Oregon and a few other places and see if it helps. I was also thinking when we jump to the Fir Grove turf issue, is maybe we should try to have a community forum that asks that bigger issue, just because this is an example, but maybe even in person, right? To see if we can actually gather, some more people in the community to start having, this, at least this dialogue about really what is common, what is our communal property as citizens, what should it be used for, who should decide. And I think theoretically, I'm assuming the majority of people say, well, we should decide, but we know that's not a reality. And how do we go beyond, um, those barriers that we've been lulled into believing these people take care of ourselves, and that's just as easy, right? Because I personally would rather watch the birds on Facebook, the parrots. Anyhow, so with the turf stuff, then what do we do? I think so that regroup, what you're talking about is okay, let's start from this issue. Although then looking at where that expertise, and I just want to add something here. There's a Progressive Oregon network that I started, that I suggested we start in Oregon at the end of the year. And so some folks have been meeting about that, and we're actually trying to develop a database of expertise. So the problem with me and a turf question, right? I like to know what I'm talking about when I advocate to government officials, and I'm kind of a control freak that way for me. But I don't know enough about certain aspects of what you say. I'm going to take your word for it. You appear to be credible, and you certainly know a heck of a lot more about it than I. But we need that expertise, right? How do we develop that citizens, if you will, expertise? We should be able to rely upon government, but this example with the fire thing, right? And look at what's happening, the devastation of everything in the federal government level, so and then the simple lobbying, and I think that I put that information up on the discussion we had on the discussion section on the YouTube channel before, but I can do it again about our city council and mayor about this issue. And really, in all those places where we see people complaining, say, here, please do this. Maybe we could set up an easy way to them to do that, right? Just, here's a link to this sheet, click on this sheet and do this. I was involved in the last effort to get right to rest at a state level, and that's kind of what we had. We had just this one little sheet. Here's a link to all their addresses. Here's what you can say, right? All this stuff. And people certainly, sometimes people like to have at least a starter of what to say. How do you enumerate the issues? Because you pointed out the commons issue, the environmental issue, safety issue, right? Um, and there's other factors, the liability issue, right? Have these things been considered? So people might want to talk from their specific point of view, and how do we do that quickly? I think between the three of us, or that we could probably create some kind of sheet to send people to, right? To say, here, just do this. And I know that sometimes it's easier for me, or the other option is like a change.org or whatever petition, right? I don't know how successful they are. Apparently, I don't use them. I've used them once in a while, but not very.
I heard there was a comment a guy made on the news review article that they had, online. Some guy commented yesterday that the Oregonian just had an article on recent data about these turf fields and you know and the damage they do. Then which was interesting. So it might behoove us to try to find that article, and you and read it, because he was condemning, after he read that article in the Oregonian, he was condemning the whole idea of turf fields. So
I'll look into it. Yeah.
Well, and part of the other thing is you can ask our elected officials to find out accurate data. You can even point out, well, this is a question that arose. What is this? What research have you done on that? Put the onus on them. But even then, you want to know enough about it on your independently. It's trust but verify is my motto in this kind of situation. So if you want to do so, I can put data, some information up there on the discussion of this, and then we can find other avenues to put it out there. It also might be something that you want to take to other organizations. I don't know if, like the Global Warming Coalition, Umpqua Watersheds, right? I think you mentioned that. You might have mentioned them last time we discussed this, John.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about at our community rights meeting on Thursday. Yeah,
and certainly the Democratic Party. I mean, I'm willing to go, and bring the issue up, just the broader issue of the commons, and in context of this, and just the way the decision was made, right? Because I could see, instead of fighting about the nuances of, whether this turf works and that doesn't, is to say the whole process needs to be, redone, because it really does look like they're pandering to a small group of people. And when you talk about public and private earlier, Zach, these are not 501c3s, even if they're 501c3s or 501c4s, they are private. They are private entities. They are not public entities. Housing First Umpqua may be, working on a progressive issue, advocating for homeless, doing it, basically for nothing. But we're still a private entity. You can't come in to our meetings unless we let you, right? You don't get a say on how we decide to do things unless we let you. So that control, right? I mean, we're not a threat on that level, but it could be. So these private clubs, these private sports clubs, they are private entities. They couldn't exist. They'd have to be formed in some legal structure, and the most sense would be a nonprofit 501c3, so they can get those cushy agreements with the cities, with governmental entities, right? Instead of having it as a for-profit corporation do it, that'd be much more problematic for the city to make that kind of agreement with that kind of entity. So there's a lot of reasons this would happen, but I think that's, fundamentally a different discussion. But we could certainly, start advocating these things, get more people involved in it, and do that education piece, but sometimes, um, somebody told me once, who's actually a doctor talking about the medical community here, oh, actually up at OHSU, about information on a patient that had been given information as a doctor. They had sent it and they didn't want to do a procedure. And he said, you can educate people and give them all the information as they want. And even doctors don't necessarily change their mind when facts contradict what they want to believe.
There are some quacks out there. And
So, well,
I
so
even recall in 2020, there were certain physicians here in Roseburg, Oregon, who downplayed COVID.
right. Yeah. Well, and there's sometimes, like institutions have a protocol for something, right? And they get very caught into it has to be this way. Well, you don't have to do that scientifically, right? You made a cutoff point and it was that kind of thing, right? But you prove that that's not true. And then they say, well, we don't want to do it. We don't want to change anyway.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
that's I think where we run up against a problem that is very prevalent here where we are, that talking about data and evidence is not necessarily what is going to change anyone's mind or turn around the whether it's a move to um, put turf in the park or not. Um, Even during the last city council meeting, we had a city councilor talk for probably like 10 minutes with lots and lots of data, citing studies on turf, citing phone call conversations with experts who they called around the state of Oregon from various universities, from people who are managing fields here in Roseburg to those who are managing like a turf field at Oregon State, asking them how is the management of this thing? How do people like this thing? What are the effects of this thing? All of that. I was there in the audience. People in the audience interrupted during the time, like yelled at this counselor during that time. There were people who were whispering to each other and just saying, "Oh, this guy is just rambling and going on, and we don't want to hear this," and rolling their eyes and making audible sighs like, "Oh, when is this going to be over?" And in contrast to that, the next counselor who spoke uh, one of the next counselors who spoke said in like 5 seconds, "Well, I've played on turf fields, and I think they're fine. I'm voting in favor of the turf," and that's that. Of course, met with round of applause. So just putting the data forward, and there's plenty of data on, whether you want to talk about the turf elements, the injury elements, playing surface, preference, what unions, athletes unions are in support of turf or grass, effects on rivers, watersheds, other elements of the ecosystem. All those I think are certainly relevant. But beside the point of this being an issue of principle, an issue of and what we even consider to be valid as objective truth or not. The denial, the rejection of data, evidence, studies, and such, that is a telltale sign of a an approach to government, administration, and um, I would say class interest in a certain understanding that is wholly disinterested in empirical fact, wholly disinterested in science for that matter. Um, this is a case of personal preference over data. And at that point, I think only issues on moral grounds can really be discussed and debated. And I think that's
yeah,
really what this is. This is a question of bureaucracy. This is a question of what a city government is, what a city council or a county commission for that matter, what they function for, or a city commission or a Parks and Rec commission. Who is sitting on these? Who controls these? What are these forms? What and who are these forms? Not just the people in them, but the forms, the city council, commissions, etc. What are they serving? And who is advocating for these kinds of projects, investments, developments, so-called, pro-business, capital investment kinds of projects? Who's benefiting? Who's being disadvantaged by them? And is this really how a city should be run? And is this really the kind of city that anyone would want to live in?
Yeah, all those things. You're right on about all those things and how, maybe just starting a public forum, doing one, doing it, in September maybe, right? Giving
Yeah,
groundwork to actually get some publicity out there and just start having that dialogue with people
yeah,
and see where it
yeah.
goes.
I'm all for it. I think if you want, we maybe can get somebody from the watersheds to participate too.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah,
good. I think
yeah,
because it is a bigger issue, not just about the turf hit,
right,
for row, but certainly watersheds, I would think would be interested in the environmental side of
right.
what's happening there, just like with the global warming. And I will approach someone at the Global Warming Coalition about it.
Okay,
How and anybody else we can find that may have a self-interest. There's actually a BIPOC group, right? And
right. Yeah,
so
he was at
it's a
our meeting.
variety of people who
Yeah,
would,
Angel. Yeah,
that actually, may have a vested interest. There's, people that live in that neighborhood, right, that aren't necessarily, and it's not one of the more affluent neighborhoods, except, really
no,
in that area of town. And so this is fundamentally access to, particularly if you have kids, right? Access to a place for them to play where it's relatively safe. So I think that, so I will put some stuff up there just on about both of the things, and I think that and then Joanne really did raise the psychological issue of this trauma about fire. I don't know that we hear discussions about that. Maybe in the future that can start happening, and because that needs to be part of the dialogue. The mental health impact of fear. That's created that is not totally unfounded, right? The reality is it's not just imaginary fear. The other thing, so a couple of things is I'm assuming you saw that the Secretary of State has, contacted my favorite public entity, Public Transit District, and say that what they've done in failing to seek this person, may violate the law. And as these things go with bureaucracies, you make a complaint, there's an investigation, right? Due process, that pesky kind of constitutional nonsense actually does apply in things like this as well. So let's see what happens there. I think that as I mentioned before when we discussed the problem, I think there is a variety of problems with what they've been doing. And fundamentally, to me, it comes down to they're denying those of us who live in the district and voted that election, of which I am one, um, our duly elected representative. So I don't know what they're going to do. And I think that Todd Vaughn had filed a lawsuit, something in Douglas County Circuit Court, and I think it had a status check on Friday. I forgot I was going to try to go, and I just slipped my mind. Uh, and so I'm interested in what that happened. I don't think that has any links, but I will look at it. So next time. But I also wanted to bring up the the whole thing about politics makes strange bedfellows. There was an article from The Hill. Marjorie Taylor Greene blasts AIPAC after it criticizes her, and it says that she doubled down on her characterization of Israel's war in Gaza as a genocide on Thursday, and slammed AIPAC for their powerful pro-Israel lobbying group criticizing her in a fundraising email. So, that reminds me, that this is a Southern Oregon progressive podcast, but it was actually the real purpose is, the populist, podcast, and it ended up with progressive podcast, but populist, that was our audience. And I think that one of the things, if you're trying to organize among everyone and reach out to people, particularly disenfranchised voters, that you have to listen to everyone, even if think that, they're going to say something, you don't agree with normally. And I got to say, Marjorie Taylor Greene is probably more likely to say something I don't agree with as opposed to this. But I think it also shows an interesting coalition potential. And one I saw in this community during, the Patriot Act, after 9/11, the Patriot Act, there was a group of people in Douglas County that came together. And we met regularly for quite a while. We actually got Bill Fisher, former state representative and senator, and Peter DeFazio to sit at the dais of the county commissioner, opposing the Patriot Act. And it was because it really was a coming together of people on the right and people on the left and people, more centrists are probably more government followers. But and I've mentioned this before that, we would have discussions, and if people segued to anything else which could cause, dissent and division, would say no, let's just focus on that. But we really did have a common desire for government transparency, and protecting these fundamental rights, that even if we didn't agree on a lot of issues themselves, agreed that if either one of them had any opportunity for promoting those issues, these things had to be protected. So I think that there are, populist messages. And I want to remind folks that, like, the vote by mail won in Douglas County when it was voted in originally. So, this effort to try to rid of vote by mail, which the Umpqua Public Transportation District and the vote by mail, the people who are now trying to overturn it, get petition signatures, they are one and the same. Michaela Hammerson, who was the board chair under the old guard, is actually one of the chief the petitioner, and then Ben Eld is actually a chief petitioner of to the vote by mail. So, those things become intertwined in this mess with the district. But anyway, but I also have listened to some of the things that they say, not Ben, because he's a new player, and a new player here in Douglas County politics. But once in a while, I try to listen to folks, to at least try to get their perspective. And I think that that's important. And I think that if we're going to have a meeting on what's the purpose of the commons, that's the kind of thing that has to be, we have to be willing to listen to people that we may not agree with. But we may have an alliance with, anti-private soccer clubs by the same people that were decades ago against the Patriot Act. Anyway, I think that's the other, interesting thing on the list of that I found in paying attention to all the flurry of news that I get. Oh, and David Brock Smith was trying to promote some kind of special water use for a golf resort in southwestern Oregon.
Right.
And Governor Kotek this last week, vetoed it. So I guess good for her. But it's once again, it kind of shows, I think, our elected representative in state government, that who they're about, right? They're not about the people. They're not about the environment. They're not even about the future of humans on the planet. So enough from me. Anybody else have anything?
Always ask questions. Don't take anything for granted. And talk to your neighbors.
Any last comments, John?
No, actually, that thing
All
with the golf course, yeah, that's been going for a while. When I was at that land use group, uh, friends of Douglas County, their meeting last September, they were having a big discussion about it too. It's like they want to put in 2 or 3 of those golf courses over there. So
And to serve whom? They're not even pretending to be private. I
No.
mean, public access. Yeah. All right. Thank you always for joining us. Some